The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, welcoming you back to our lecture series on Pictures at an Exhibition with the second part of Limoges. The first time that I took a stab at lecturing on this particular movement, I thought that I could cover all the material in one lecture, but that would have ended up being 2 hours long. So I've split this into 2 lectures, and that way I can go over all the little bits and pieces that help to reveal what Ravel is really doing in this most complex of his orchestrations for this particular work. If you watch the first part, you'll remember that the original piano version has this really cool section where the time signature changes to 3/4, and it sounds very much like Prokofiev from that point. Bump, ba-da-da-da-da-bump, ba-da-bump, ba-da-da-da-da-bump, and so on. Right, so here is that section, which we're going to look at now. And it looks pretty complicated, but in actuality, the orchestration style is divided into 4 parts. So there are these 2 bars here, and then these 2 bars, and then this 1 bar here, and then across these 3 bars here towards the end of the screen, that is one last way of orchestrating this material. All right, so let's start with the first 2. Here Ravel is using the seconds to convey the melody, and then having an answer come from the first flute and first oboe, with clarinet harmonization below, and rhythmic punctuation coming from first trumpet and snare drum. And of course, pizzicato, just hitting that third beat nice and hard from the cellos and the first violins. Meanwhile, below, we've got some timekeeping from our violas. I love the way that this downbeat gets hit, right? It's got a triple stop in the firsts and in the seconds as well. So you've got an open E here at the top, and then you play a G third below that, right? And that is the kind of chord that is possible easily, well, a little squeaky to make a third right down there in that lower position. But it's, a middle grade difficulty triple stop. And then we've got harp, and we've got the jeu de timbre hitting that one little note there, and the rest of the percussion, and some upper winds. So yeah, so it is a nice little spike right there. And I've heard some orchestras really punch right here at 67. But I really like the way the Thai Philharmonic just takes it in stride. And they just give a little emphasis to this, more in the strings than anywhere else. But really, it's really only marked as an accent in the strings, in the upper strings. So that's all that they get, right? So that's the approach for the first 2 bars of this screen. Now notice that Ravel keeps things interesting by alternating harmonic and thematic roles. By giving the thirds that the clarinet was playing on the third beat to the oboes, and then having these little slashing down tuplets given to the piccolo and clarinet. So you get a bit of a slicing sound to that little reaction. Now the roles are changed here, but it's really the same kind of music, right? Mussorgsky finally arrives at A flat after descending for a couple of bars, and he stays with A flat for a while. So it only makes sense to orchestrate these pretty much the same exact way both times, right? There are some changes to the winds, right? We've got this little A flat here, which is an octave higher than the A flat which follows in both flutes. And this is doubling with the clarinets here. And that lower A flat is going to be a bit weak, honestly speaking, right? But it's okay. I mean, I probably would have orchestrated this a little bit differently, given the E flat to the second flute right here, and given this low A flat to the oboe, second oboe. But whatever, that's Ravel. Yeah, he's painting with colors right here, and I'll go with his decision, but still just guardedly. So the strings, however, are pretty much playing it, for the upper strings anyhow, are playing it identical both times, and pretty close for the violas, hitting this E flat right here. Notice that the second time it's arco, right? The first time it's pizzicato, right? We've got that change of timbre that comes with the change of technique. Then, of course, we've got the cellos doubling with the bassoons, right? So, what is the emphasis happening around this shell, around this framework? And that is really the trumpet taking over, right? Coming off of this, right? It's got this little bit of sunshine that it gets to itself, supported from below by the horns. Remember your transposition, right? This is an A flat coming in under this B natural in the C trumpet. And yeah, here the percussion becomes more prominent, right? We just have one stroke, very effective though, on the snare drum, and a couple of tishes from the cymbals. So that really wraps that up. The whole thing is set up as a framework around the brass suddenly coming up to the front of our consciousness. Notice how Ravel is balancing with his dynamics here, just a little bit, which I would find to be acceptable just given the context, right? I try not to have more than a couple of different dynamic signs in any particular arrangement, right? But here we've got P covering these first two beats, right? So piano, we've got these guys in the background. This is piano, this is mezzo piano, this is mezzo forte in the trumpet, and this is forte for the horns, right? So it is a bit tortuous, right? It's kind of better to not do that too much, but there is such delicate tone painting in this that I will give Ravel a pass because he knows what he's doing. Oftentimes I will get a score from a developing orchestrator that just has different dynamics all over the place. And obviously that is a reflection of maybe overthinking, or perhaps what we hear in heavily mixed recordings such as film scores or very, very carefully balanced commercial recordings of concert music. So moving onwards, we have this one bar here that's got its own approach happening, which is mirrored following on in certain little ways, but really it's enough of its own thing, right? Some strong contribution here by harp and the jeu de timbre. And this really reminds me, when you add the pizzicato to it, and you also add the harmonic context and the punchiness of the upper winds, tripled, really. This is a tripled figure here. Put that all together, and the work that comes to mind is The Sorcerer's Apprentice, especially when you consider that it was probably the jeu de timbre that was intended for the glockenspiel part, which is why you see glockenspiel players using mallets just killing themselves to get things right, get things absolutely perfect in those very complicated lines of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which would just be simple on a keyboard glockenspiel, right? Some people say, well, there is a slight difference in tone quality between the jeu de timbre and the glockenspiel, and should I explore that? And I don't know if it's really all that pronounced, but you can kind of hear it here when the jeu de temps is really pushed to its limit in terms of dynamics, right? When it's being played as just as loud as possible. I feel that it's just easier for the hammers, and the hammers on the metallic bars have a different kind of a sound than the normal mallets that a percussionist would be playing. So to that extent, yes, you'll get a different sound, though it's not really a different instrument. Do you see what I'm saying? It just has to do with the mallets that are being used versus the hammers. And you see that emerging here as well, right? Don't get confused by the fact that this drops an octave. It just has to do with the kind of transposition that you get from the jeu de temps versus the other C instruments, concert instruments in the score. So it is or should be 2 octaves apart, right? So this comes over the top of these upper winds at a very, very high sound. It should really be jingly. And then Ravel drops it an octave just because the texture is lighter. But it still is a very prominent sound. And it does blend together with these different groupings of winds. Once again, Ravel is keeping things varied, right? So flute plus oboe, oboe plus clarinet, and then all 3 of them together at the end when he picks up steam once more. This is really cool here. These horns sort of ripping downwards on a slur. That is a very big sound. Fortissimo, which is being punctuated by the pizzicato that you're seeing here in the violas and violins. And of course, by harp and so on. And then the horns play this lovely little harmonized figure here with the trumpet right on top. And this is also a very cool sound. Notice that Ravel is really playing it safe, using the first and third rather than the first and second, which either would work fine, but this actually works better with the third because the third is a bit of a virtuoso in waiting, right? He's the heavyweight on the bench who comes forward to join in with the first or cover for the first or give the first a break, as opposed to the second, who is the unified partner of the first. So this works out better just because you have both of those heavyweights really blasting away. Now, as we move on, I've already talked about some of the elements here. But what I think is really cool here is the importance of the cellos in getting fairly high, right? Reaching up to G sharp and then finally all the way up to A. And being doubled, transposed, and enharmonically by the clarinets here, right? So it's a B flat instrument, right? So F sounding E flat, written as D sharp for the cellos. So rising little figure, dropping figure, right? From very high bassoons and English horn playing in a triple unison there. And then bassoons take over in doubling the cellos. And the little descending bit is just given to first horn, right? Mezzo forte. And that is enough to compensate for replacing these 3 wind instruments. And, of course, they've already done something similar 2 bars before, right? Same exact figure was played from in first and third, as we were just talking about, right? Then here, bassoons basically stick with the cellos there. Okay, that little descending riff is played once again by first and third horn. Notice how the little ends of these downward rips are always major seconds, right? We got this A natural and C flat, right? Or enharmonically a B natural. And then right here we've got a B and an A, same as here. with the little third coming in and playing that little note there. And here they rip up on the same pitches as the cellos and bassoons. So it really gives this a powerful push. Even though dynamically this would appear to be softer than this sort of splashy bar, it still gives us a sense of growing power and is setting up the return to common time, right? And then, of course, in the middle of all that, we have this little slashing upwards of arco, pizzicato, arco, and so on in the upper strings. And that sort of gives us the rhythmic and harmonic cushion behind all of this dancing around. And you'll notice when you listen to this, it really does remind you of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, or it reminds me anyhow. Let's look at just 3 more bars before we have a listen to this. Ravel sticks with the cellos, bassoons, and horns. At the end of each of these little motives, the middle winds and upper strings come in, sort of polishing off the end, and then that turns into its own emphatic phrase, setting this up, bum 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 da da, and so on, right? So increasing presence of snare drum, increasing cymbal, and obviously this is intended to be played with a beater rather than clashed together because it's followed by a cymbal roll. Right? And this also works really, really well on jeu de timbre, rather than mallets on a glockenspiel. I mean, yeah, it's easy to play a trill with mallets, but I just feel that the kind of dexterity that's intended here is really more of a keyboard dexterity, right, rather than a mallet one. Then, of course, yeah, you've got that roll in both the triangle and the snare drum. It's really interesting, though, how the piccolo is doubling the jeu de timbre, right? So that creates this really bustling, fierce, snarling, playful little apex of excitement. This might be the place where a couple of the gossips start physically getting into it and they have to be dragged to their corners by their friends. Anyhow, getting back to the setup here. I was talking about these last 3 eighth notes, about how they were built from the little fragments that caught the top of this figure. Ravel very wisely doesn't even bother scoring harp. It's just really can barely contribute anything at the energy that is building right here. The real stars here are the brass. First and second trumpet, off 4 horns on the same exact notes. It's really the first trumpet that is getting this top line all to their lonely selves, whereas the second trumpet is just punctuating what's happening in the horns, if you remember your transpositions. The trumpet does get some doubling from some of its neighbors in the wind section, though. So this is probably intended to be A2 oboes, first clarinet, and first violins, and violas. That is a very emphatic, direct sound on that top line, accompanying the trumpet. But most of the weight is an octave below, really, when you look at it. English horn, second clarinet, both bassoons, second violins, the lower divisi violas and cellos. But it doesn't matter because high above that, we've got A2 flutes. They're going to underline the overtone strongly enough to where that first trumpet just stands out beautifully. Right? So this is also very, very crafty orchestration. Everybody just hits this at a halt except for first and second trumpet, and this is cool. It's obvious scoring, but it's really cool all the same. With the first trumpet just repeating that top D and the second trumpet descending chromatically. And notice that all of the upper strings are doubling the second trumpet as things descend. And of course, this is just showing you the power of how strong the brass are. In this little decrescendo right here, the strings are not going to overbalance what's going on here between these two trumpet players. Right? It will come off sounding good, and it is also better to have the sense of motion from the strings here, rather than to have maybe the first violins just doubling the top line of the trumpets. Now that I've explained all of that, let's jump back to 67 and listen to all of those things all the way through. It's very, very fast music. It's very complexly scored, but really try to focus on which instruments are carrying the melody, how the harmony is being interpreted from bar to bar, what are the coloristic changes in these different sections. Remember the divisions here, these first two bars, and then these next two bars having slightly different colors and approaches, and then this big spike here where the brass really come up to the fore, and you hear the jeu de timbre having a really prominent role as well, which, I don't know, you listen to it. I feel is reminiscent of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, going on to how these elements are played with over the next three bars in their own sort of context, and then how everything wraps up beautifully and comically violent right here by this second bar on this screen. And then see if you agree with me whether or not the diving strings here balance out, just doubling that second trumpet. One thing I failed to mention is that the cool thing here is that the second trumpet is slurring downwards, whereas the first trumpet is just tonguing separate Ds right here. So it gives both lines a very, very different sound. Of course, the first beat of that bar is extremely pointy because of both trumpet players at fortissimo playing the same exact note in unison. Actually getting all the way up to here, right? But then that swoop downwards being doubled by all the upper strings also has its own really cool character and does not swamp the upper line there. Here at rehearsal figure 69, we come back to the key signature of E flat major, and here's the recap. And if you put those pages of score side by side, you'll see that really Ravel is just repeating exactly what he did before in terms of his orchestration, note for note. So there's no reason to go over this again, because it's going to really be the same until you get to this bar, the second bar after figure 70. And here you'll see the return of those figures, those gestures that we saw in the section that I just lectured to you about. So there isn't a huge need to go over those in enormous detail, but we'll just point out a few differences and similarities. So the strings are doing very similar things in this bar in terms of creating that harmonic background to a degree. We've got cellos, bassoons, and English horn in unison on those little upward slashing motives. And then we've got the upper winds completing the gesture to a degree. A little bit of help from harp. And the return of the jeu de timbre, but in this case, trumpet is doubling from below. right? And that gives a very, very pointy sound. One thing that people fail to explore with their trumpet scoring is getting an extra piercing, extra trebly sound by doubling it from above by, say, piccolo, or in this case, jeu de timbre. You could use other high bell-like instruments, or say, E-flat clarinet. If you just really want a very slashing, very pointy, high sound, then rather than push your trumpets too high, I mean, here they're going all the way up to B flat, so that is actually pretty high, but you could be going maybe no higher than G, but if you are doubling that from 1 or 2 octaves above by higher wind instruments, say, or maybe very slashing sounds on the violins, or let's say in a softer context, pizzicato by high violins. But all of these different contexts can just really make the sound of the trumpet become extremely pointy, extremely trebly. And if that's what you want, you can achieve that without pushing the trumpets too high. Okay, so that's your tip for this particular screen. But in this case, it just really makes the jeu de timbre stick out, I feel. So it works the opposite way as well. And we're seeing some similar things too, just the sense of franticness by repeating certain figures, which is in the piano score and realized here beautifully by Ravel. And of course, very similar to the end of the section we just studied as well. We'll take apart a little bit of it, but we don't need to overdo it, right? Here we see the horns just kind of going back and forth here on F and D, which is doubled by the cellos, right? And the top note of these little dancing eighth notes is also played by A2 bassoons. And they're just really punching that first note, even though there's no accent here in the cellos. There could have been, and that would have really supported the bassoons here. But that's not what Ravel wanted, because here he wants to emphasize the offbeat, right, rather than the onbeat. So the other side of this little back and forth eighth note figure is going to be emphasized, and that is being played by cor anglais, and of course every other eighth note by the cellos. So yeah, just remember that transposing, this D is the same as this written A in the English horn. Okay, so that takes care of that little figure in terms of the back and forth. And it's also being emphasized by snare and cymbal, right? They're going back and forth too. And a little bit of weight is being pushed here by the harp. And if this is loud and nicely rolled, you'll hear some of it, even though there's so much excitement happening. Then what Ravel needs is just this little ba-da-dump idea, right? And that is being played by violas, doubled by trumpets. So you might think, well, violas and trumpets, that just really seems dodgy. How could a viola compete with the trumpet? Well, the honest truth is that it really can't, but it can add a color behind the trumpets without being completely lost, right? If you wanted to really emphasize the violas here, you would have to cut the trumpets back to about, say, mezzo piano, mezzo forte. But do you remember what I was talking about in some other posts recently? Here is an example of unison divisi and then the approach being maintained, and the composer or publisher writing simile. They could have just said SIM period, sim. If you are going to be going back and forth between those markings over and over, right? All right, so here is a published example of what I am talking about. Okay. Here, you can't quite do that because there are three things at play here. We have the arco, we have the unison divisi, and everything else. It's better just to mark all of them and be clear about it. But here, when you have repeating figures, especially, or repeating approaches, then that's the place where you put in the sim. All right. So that takes care of that. And then the only thing left is the little 16th notes that are playing off of it, right? And Ravel just goes for the most safe and effective scoring. So all of the violins, firsts and seconds, playing that same F diving down to B flat. And that is doubled by just the A2 flutes. And then rising up to meet them, we've got the F going up to B flat with the oboes and A2 clarinets. And that just has a fierce, fierce sound. I think that the gossips are mixing it up again. They're hitting each other with breadsticks or something. I don't know. They're really arguing over certain points. They're really trying to decide which is the most important big news that they've got to share. Let's have a listen to all of that. You'll recognize all the scoring that we talked about in the last lecture coming up here to the second bar after 70, and then after that you'll recognize elements that I lectured about in the previous screen. And then here we just have very fierce, very forward scoring that is punchy and exciting and snarly. And then we'll take a look at the coda on the last screen. Okay, so many fun things to talk about here on the very last screen. First is meno mosso, and yet the music feels faster, right? That is just because there is a rhythmic condensation of the melody, right? So the melody is kind of going double speed now, so Mussorgsky decides to play it a little slower, and that way he can throw in all of the tremolo between the hands. Now, if you remember, this was a situation where the left hand was playing the melody and then the right hand was playing chords above. And it was just going back and forth between the hands, right? So Ravel has got to interpret that in a way that is reasonable. I have seen developing orchestrators get thrown by this, in the sense that they will try to have the orchestra really go back and forth, right? They will try to have one half of the orchestra play on all the on beats and the other half to play on all the off beats. And that kind of stuff is really hard to put together in rehearsal. You don't know what you are asking. Unless you are really an experienced orchestrator and you have a plan for it and there's something to do that goes beyond just interpreting something that was written for two hands going back and forth, right? So, Ravel chooses, instead of having back and forth type scoring, to just do repeated notes. All right, so that is the safest way to approach that. And you still get that sense of excitement, and who knows what is happening in Mussorgsky's mind here in terms of the picture that was painted by his friend. Is this meant to describe a huge argument breaking out with everybody shouting at each other and just telling their own opinions, or an actual melee where the gossips are just getting too physical? Well, of course we've all seen things like that, when people are very passionate about their arguments and little tiny things, little points of politeness and manners and everything like that get argued to death until people are just really have gone beyond all sense of propriety and manners and everything else, right? So that actually can be kind of fun in terms of like a comical situation, but it's kind of bad when people get damaged emotionally or just really live to create chaos and hassle people, which is why we don't have those kinds of exchanges in the orchestration online community, and it's just too much for me to babysit, really. But here we're looking at a massive fight, I think. That is the point right here. So let's just talk about that melody. And it's being played in the perfect left-hand interpreter by the cellos. Right, they're really taking the lead on this and underlining that melody, and actually fairly high register, right? So it's tenor register and reaching all the way up to a C right there, right? So it's almost going all the way up to where you would want to put it in treble clef to read it well. But tenor clef maybe would be easier than this. Anyhow, it doesn't really matter. And those are exactly the same notes as you are seeing here, played by horn, and it's a beautiful register for horn. Just absolutely the best. Notice that the trumpets don't even contribute, except for just a little bit of accenting in the middle of the bar and then the beginning of the bar here. They're not even needed because this is such a choice area for your horn heavyweights, the first and the third, right? The second and fourth don't even do anything. They're not even needed. All that's needed is just a blast away on the horns as they are doubling the cellos, and of course we've got a little bit of bassoon in there too. English horn is just adding a little bit of punch here and there under the trumpets. And then it's just left to everybody else to interpret those chords that were going on in the right hand. And they are fairly true to the piano score in terms of their voicings and their positions on the staff. Really some pretty basic doubling here. We've got oboes and clarinets in different parts of the right-hand chord voicings. We've got flute basically playing the top line all the way through. We've got the upper strings avoiding any kind of divisi or double stops or anything like that. This is a very, very loud, raucous, rustic, I would say even, interpretation of what happened in Mussorgsky's piano score, and there really is no need to lose any kind of force from the strings. Here is exactly the place where I would say, yeah, just don't do any divisi and don't even bother with double stops because you're going so fast, right? This is meno mosso, but really it's being played sort of prestissimo in terms of all of the notes that need to be played. This is not an unmeasured tremolo, all right? Ravel intends for there to be exactly 32 notes per bar, individually articulated, okay? So at that kind of speed of the bow, you just do not have time to mess around. And that is also why the same approach is being given to the horns, which have no problem going tucka 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 tucka, as opposed to the more elegant winds who are not being asked to do that except for the flutes, which will have absolutely no problem doing that kind of double tonguing. All right. So there is a reason why things are set up the way that they are. And of course, we've got our lovely trade-offs here between the snare drum and the cymbals. I think that's so cool. Notice spongy beater, right? In other words, a soft mallet for the cymbal. So soft stick doesn't mean that your cymbal is going to be any softer. It just means it's going to have more of a whooshing sound or like a plashing sound than a tishing sound, right? And harp thrown in just to throw it in, not that it's really going to be heard or anything. And at the end, everybody just rises up in excitement, and this outpouring of life and chaos and fun is going to be brought back down to earth by the very first beat of the catacombs. which will make things immediately serious again. And I wonder whether or not those paintings were displayed next to each other. We do have the painting of the Catacombs by Hartmann, and I'm actually wondering whether there are several paintings, not just the one that we have today, but whether or not he had done a series of them. Because after all, it's beautiful what he painted. I'm bringing it up here on the screen to look at in advance of the next lecture. And I'm thinking with such gorgeous colors and such wonderful contrasts of the observer and the deceased and the atmosphere and everything like that, whether or not Hartmann painted other parts of the catacombs that he had a chance to visit. He is actually one of the people in this painting, which I'll talk about more in the next lecture. So I'm just wondering whether or not that was displayed next to Limoges, and looking from one painting to the other brought Mussorgsky's imagined ideas of joy and chaos and fun and excitement and silliness immediately down to earth. And that is the reason why we have the first note of the Catacombs attached to the end of this bar. One last thing that I'll point out is that Ravel plays it safe, and he doesn't bother having any kind of measured tremolo on the very, very last note here in the strings. And he also just lets the cellos stop for the last two beats. Same thing with the trumpet that eventually comes in to support the horns at the same exact pitch, right? The horns give up here by the time they get to their written G, which is the same as this concert C. And just like the horns, it's no big deal for the trumpet players just to go tucka 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 all the way up here. But they themselves do not bother going tucka at the end. They just go bip, right? And that is the end, this nice staccato here. So think about all those things. Think about the snare drum and cymbal trading off. See if you can actually hear any harp at all, which I don't know if you will be unless they recorded it with the mic near the harpist. Listen for that little triangle right at the end there. Listen for how the repeated instruments, the instruments with measured tremolo, are really all just strings and brass and a little bit of flute on top. Listen for that sort of sense of back and forth as interpreted by single instruments. And I will see you for the next lecture on Catacombs, which is going to be a massive brass extravaganza.